Hello, and welcome back to Intro to Programming. So we're going to continue looking at JavaScript today, and specifically we're going to look at for loops. All right, so for loops are a device in computer science that are going to allow us to repeat code a set number of times. All right, and your very first exposure to this was back on probably the second day of class when we did this Angry Birds tutorial, all right? And once you got like 6 or 7 in, you started to see these ones where they had this, what was called a repeat block. And what that allowed you to do is it allowed you to put a small piece of code inside of the repeat block. And then instead of having to write the same code over and over and over again, you could just instruct the program to execute it however many times you wanted. So if I wanted to run it 20 times, all I had to do was change that one number. I didn't have to write move forward 20 times. And then if I hit play, it would go and do whatever it needed to do. All right, that's embarrassing. I didn't get that right because first you have to turn and then move forward. There we go. All right, just making sure I could still solve this. But you may or may not have done this at the time, but if you click on the Show Code button right here, all right, underneath you will see that that repeat block is really what's called a for loop. All right, and the for loop has these 3 different parts, and we're going to talk about those parts in a little more detail when we actually open up the sheets, the files that we're working with today. All right, but that's our main focus for today is going to be this idea of looping. And again, looping just allows us to repeat code over and over and over again, so that instead of having to write the same code 30 times, we can write the code once and then tell it to loop again and again and again and again. Because remember, the one thing that computers are really good at is doing things quickly. So there's times when we want to have it do something over and over and over again, and we can just stick it inside of a loop and have it do that for us. All right, so let's get to the actual files that we're going to be using today. So in your email or from Google Classroom, you're going to be downloading the zip file called for loops. All right, once you have it downloaded, again, remember you can right-click on it and choose Extract All. And then usually wherever it's saying is fine. There's usually no reason to change that. And if you click Extract, you'll get another version of that. It opens it right up, but there's my other version. All right. Once I have the other version, I don't really need the zip file anymore. So if you want, you can throw that away or you can leave it there. Doesn't really matter. But inside of here, there are 2 files, one called for puzzle, one called for loops. So for right now, we're going to open up the one called for loops. So I'm going to right-click on it, choose Edit with Notepad++. That's going to bring up all the code. And then if I view the file in Chrome, we can see what it does. So right now, across the top, you'll see that it's counted 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then it's repeated this phrase high class 10 times. Then we have I is 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And then we have this table here that seems to go up by 4s. All right, so we're going to take a look at all of this. We're going to see what all of this is actually doing. And then we'll go from there. All right, so let's take a look at our code. We've got our head section, we've got our title section, we've got our body, and then inside the body we have some script because we're going to be dynamically creating this page. All right, there's actually no HTML. I mean, there's HTML because there's an HTML tag, a body tag, and head tags, but there's no paragraph tags or anything that are hard-coded into it. Everything is sort of being created as the page loads through this JavaScript. So at the top here, I have 2 variables. Remember, whenever we create a variable, we need this var statement. It's like our declaration. I keep comparing it to the let statement in algebra. So I have a variable I that currently doesn't have anything inside of it. And then I have a variable called texts, which has the phrase high class in it. Now, right below this is our first for loop. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the syntax so we can see what's happening here. All right, so the word for is in all lowercase. All right, there is a left and a right parenthesis. And then inside of that left and right parenthesis, there are three pieces. All right. There is the starting point for your variable. So my variable is starting at the number 1. There is a test that's going to be used to decide when the loop stops. So my loop keeps going as long as I is less than or equal to 5. All right. When this test is no longer true, the loop will stop. So when I gets to 6, it's no longer less than or equal to 5, so the loop will stop. And then this shows how I changes each time through the loop. So what this I equals I plus 1 means is that each time the loop executes, I will get 1 bigger. Now, down below here, this is just dynamically creating text on the page. So document.write is just going to print something out to the page. And what it's going to print out is the variable I. All right. And I know that it's the variable I because it's not inside of quotations. And then it doesn't actually print out a plus sign. This is called concatenation. And we're going to be combining the variable I with just a space. So that's just going to space things out so that the numbers don't end up right next to each other. So if we go back to Chrome really quick, this is the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 that you see printed out on the screen here. All right, so let's kind of walk through this step by step so we can understand what happens. So when the program starts, I is 1. All right, the very first thing that happens is we check to see whether or not I is less than or equal to 5. It is, so we're good there. Then we execute this line. So we print out I, which is printing out the 1. After we execute this line and reach the end of the loop, we go and add 1 to I. So now I is going to be the value 2. We then check to see if 2 is less than 5. It is. So we execute this code. Then we go back up here. I gets set to 3. We check to see if it's less than 5 or equal to 5. It is. So we write out this code. Then we go back up here. I becomes 4. We check to make sure it's still less than 5. It is. So we print out the code. All right. Goes back up here. I becomes 5. That's still true. So we still execute this code. All right. We go back up here. I becomes 6. We check. 6 is no longer less than or equal to 5. So we skip the code in the loop and go down to the rest of the program. All right, so if we're kind of thinking about the order here, this happens first. We set it to 1. Then we check to see if it's less than 5. Then we execute the code. Then we change the variable. And then we check to make sure it's still true. And then execute the code, change the variable, make sure it's still true. Execute the code, change the variable, make sure it's not true. The first time this is not true, we then skip the code and go down to the rest of the program. All right, so that's how we're printing out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 using this loop here. All right, so I didn't have to have 5 separate document writes. I had 1 document write and I put it inside of a loop. And if I wanted to change how high I was going up to, I wouldn't have to copy and paste a bunch of whole document writes. I could just change this number. And I could say, all right, now I is less than or equal to 50. And if I save this and refresh the page, now all of a sudden I get all of those right away because the loop is doing the work for me. All right, I'm not writing 50 separate statements. I'm letting the loop do the work for me. So if we go down to this second one here, all right, it's very similar, only this time I'm starting at 0. I'm going from less than 10. And the parts that is new is this I++. And I++ is just shorthand for I equals I plus 1. All right, it means that I is going to get 1 bigger each time through the loop. All right, and it's so common to have to do this that we just have this shorthand. So instead of having to write out I equals I plus 1, If we write out I++, that means the same thing. So again, our loop's going to start at 0. We're going to make sure that it's less than 10. It is, so we're fine. And then we're going to do the document.write, and we're printing out the variable texts. And I know it's the variable and not the word because it's outside of quotations. So what I'm doing here is I'm creating a paragraph tag. I'm printing out my variable texts, and then I'm making a closing paragraph tag. So when we look at the page, that's why I just keep getting high class, high class, high class on different lines, because each time I'm making a new paragraph tag, and that brings me down a line. And so again, I'm just dynamically creating this page by putting this HTML inside of the document.write. And again, I could mess with these and instantly change what the page looks like just by flipping around those numbers. So now I'm only going to get 5 high classes. All right. Now, loops don't only have to count up, they can count down. All right. So here I have a loop that instead of starting at 0 or 1 is starting at 5. Right? Now, when I'm counting down, I'm no longer doing I less than a value. I'm doing I greater than a value. So this loop is going to keep running as long as I is greater than 0. Now, I minus minus is just the reverse of I plus plus. Instead of I getting 1 bigger each time, I is going to get 1 smaller each time. I could have written this as I equals I minus 1. It would do the same exact thing. But the shorthand for that is just I minus minus. All right, it makes I get 1 smaller. But everything else is the same. All right, it works the same exact way. So I starts at 5. 5 is greater than 0. So we execute this code, which just makes an H4 tag and writes I is. That's all regular text because it's in quotes. This is a variable because it's outside of the quotes, and these plus signs attach it to the regular text. Again, it's called concatenation. And then we continue on with the rest of the HTML here. All right, so where was it? All right, so we start at 5. It's greater than 0. We print it out. I then becomes 4, still greater than 0. We print it out. I becomes 3, still greater than 0. Print it out, and so on and so forth. So that's just printing it out over and over and over and over again. Now, you do have to be careful when you're setting up these loops, all right? If you make a mistake, it's possible to create what's called an infinite loop, all right? And let me show you an example of an infinite loop. Let's say I wanted to do this, and I wanted to have one that was as long as I is less than 10, but I made a mistake, and instead of writing I++, I wrote I minus minus. All right, let's think about what this is saying. This is saying I starts at 0, and it's going to keep going as long as I is less than 10. And each time through the loop, I is going to get 1 smaller. So it's going to start off at 0. It's going to print it out. I is going to go to -1. It's going to print it out. It's going to go to -2. It's print it out. -3, print it out. -4, print it out. It's never not going to be less than 10. This middle part is always going to be true. So your loop is never going to end. Now, what happens if you create an infinite loop? So if I refresh this page, you're going to see that it didn't refresh. And now, well, now it refreshed. But this loop, this little icon here just keeps spinning. All right. And it keeps spinning because it's stuck in an infinite loop. All right. Now, it's just going to keep running and running and running and running, and it's never going to end because I think I may have just crashed my recording, creating an infinite loop. Maybe not. Maybe you're still hearing me. I don't know. We'll see what happens. All right, so it's giving me a chance to exit the page, so I'm going to do that. And we'll see whether or not it's going to crash my recording or not. Fingers crossed that it doesn't, but it might. We'll see what happens. All right, so if I close this out, we should be back to normal now. All right, but basically the computer got stuck in a loop and it just kept going down and down and down and down and down and down, and it was never going to get out of this code because you were stuck in sort of an infinite loop there. All right, so you do have to be careful when you're creating these because you can unintentionally, cause problems if you're doing things incorrectly. So I'm just going to set this back to 5 greater than 0, and that should work again. All right. So if I launch this now, it should be back to normal. And it is. All right. Last but not least, we have this table down here. So this is an example of how you can use this to your advantage. So like if you had a bunch of data, you could use a for loop to create the table for you. All right. So here we have a document.write. This is creating the start of the table because I don't want that to be part of the loop. I only need one table tag. Then I'm starting my first row. And then inside here, I have a loop. So this loop is saying that it starts at 4, that it goes until it's less than or equal to 200. And instead of going up by 1, this one's going up by 4. All right, so you can have it go up by different amounts. This one just happens to be going up by 4. So it's going to go from 4 to 8 to 12 to 16 to so on and so forth. All right. Then inside of the loop, I have a document.write that's creating a table box. All right, so this is the TD tag that creates a table box. It prints out the value of I, and then it creates the ending table box. Now, this down here is an if statement. All right, we've seen these before. What you might not be familiar with is this percent sign. So let's see if we can figure out what this percent sign is actually doing. So right now, if I look at my table, I can see that when I get to 16, I go to a new row. And then when I get to 32, I go to a new row. And then when I get to 48, I go to a new row. And when I get to 64, I go to a new row. And it might not be totally obvious what's happening yet, but let's play around with these numbers and see if we can kind of figure it out. So I'm going to change this 16 to a 20. And then let's see what happens. So I'm going to save this. I'm going to refresh this. And now you can see my table has changed. All right. Now I get to a new row whenever I see 20 or 40 or 60 or 80 or 100. All right, so let's change it again. Let's change this to 50 and see what happens now. All right, so I'm going to put in there 50. And you're going to see that when I did 50, I only ended up with 2 rows. All right, one after the number 100, one after the number 200. Okay. Let's see what happens if I change this to 4. Well, now I'm getting basically every time I have a number, I have a brand new row. Right, let's try 1 or 2 more. We'll try 1 more, and then we'll see. We'll talk about what's happening. So now I'm dividing by 8. All right, let's see what happened. Oops, I just gave something away. All right, now I've got 8 in there. What's happening? All right, now I've got 2 numbers per row. So you may have figured it out at this point, but if not, what this is doing is it's dividing I by whatever number you type here. Now, the part that might not be obvious is it's not giving you the answer for the division. It's giving you the remainder. All right, so think about like old school division. All right, old school division, when you were doing old school division, you might have had a problem that was like, oh, I'm going to do 7 divided by 2. And the answer is 3 with a remainder of 1. Or I'm going to do 22 divided by 8. And the answer is 2 with a remainder of 6. All right, this was kind of the way that you originally learned how to do division. You didn't worry about fractions. You didn't worry about decimals. You just saw how many times a number could go in, and then you figured out what was left over. All right, this percent sign only tells you the remainder part. All right, so if I did 7% sign 2, the answer would be 1. If I did 22% sign 8, the answer would be 6. It doesn't care about the first part. It only cares about the remainder. All right, so we can use this to figure out when things are evenly divisible. So when I say I %8 equals 0, I'm saying, hey, if when you divide a number by 8, there's no remainder, create a new row, because that's what this code is doing. It's ending the first row and starting a new row. If I change this to I %20, that's saying, hey, divide I by 20, and if the remainder is 0, create a new row. All right, so let's take a look at the page again, and we can see that's exactly what's happening. All right. When I divide 4 by 20, there's a remainder. When I divide 16 by 20, there's a remainder. When I divide 20 by 20, there's no remainder, so we create a new row. All right. Again, same thing here. 24 divided by 20, 28 divided by 20, 32 divided by 20. All of these are going to have remainders. When I get to 40 divided by 20, there's no remainder, which allows me to create a new row. All right, so again, you can start using other things inside of these loops to create different patterns, to create different structures, again, to kind of make your life easier so that you just have to set up the structure and then you let the computer do the rest of the work. All right, and a lot of times, if we go back to sort of our database ideas, we were writing those SQL queries and you would get a list of results. All right. Now, in a more advanced class, what you would learn to do is take those results, put them inside of a loop, and use the loop to format them on a web page. So it's not that somebody's individually creating, when you get search results, it's not that somebody's individually like setting up that page. They're getting the results from the database. The database is looping through those results, and it's creating the format of the page using something like what I have here. All right, so that's kind of an introduction to for loops. Now, things that I want to emphasize here, again, with the syntax. You've got the word for, all lowercase, has to be all lowercase. All right, that is always followed by parentheses. These are not curly braces, these are regular parentheses. You have to have these 3 pieces inside. You have a starting value for your variable. Notice that's followed by a semicolon. You have the test for your variable. Again, followed by a semicolon. Tests can be less thans. They can be greater thans. They can be greater than or equal tos. They can be less than or equal tos. They can be equal to. Now notice when you're doing equal to, it has double equal signs. But generally, we're not actually going to use equal to, because think about it, the loop only runs when this test is true. So if you were to try to run this loop, I would be equal to 1. I is not equal to 50, so the loop would end and you'd never actually get to do anything. So again, double equal isn't usually common for these. Almost all of the time, you're going to be doing less than, equal to, or greater than or equal to. There's also not equal to, which is a exclamation point and an equal sign. But again, you're not really going to be using those inside of a loop. It's usually going to be less than, greater than, less than or equal to, greater than or equal to. All right, that middle test is also followed by a semicolon. Right? Now, when we get to the third piece, this is how your variable changes. Notice that there is no semicolon here. Right? If you add a semicolon to this third piece, the program will not run. All right, that's a syntax error. So remember, the first one is followed by a semicolon. The second one is followed by a semicolon. The third one has no semicolon. All right, and this can either be written out, I equals I plus 1, or you can use the shorthand I plus plus. If you're going up by a number other than 1, you either have to do it the long way, which is I equals I plus 5, or 6, or 7, or 8, or 2, or whatever you're going up by. Or the other shorthand that you can use is I plus equals 2, and that's the same as writing I equals I plus 2. Again, no need to do that. I would recommend just writing it out the long way as you're getting used to this, but there are shortcuts that you can use for that. Right? So that's the setup of our for loop. Then we have a left curly brace and a right curly brace, all right? That marks the code that will be repeated. So any code that you want to be repeated has to go inside the left curly brace and before the right curly brace, all right? This marks the beginning and the end of the loop, all right? So let's now talk about what you're doing today. So there is a lab document, and there are 4 required elements to this lab document, all right? And it's basically just writing 4 separate for loops, all right? Now, it probably is not going to take very long to do these 4 loops. That's fine. Down below that, there are a series of challenge problems. Now, here's the deal with the challenge problems. If you are behind on your other labs, if you are behind on your website, I would not spend your time on these challenge problems. I would do these 4 loops, I would submit the assignment, and I would move on to the stuff that you need to work on. If you're in good shape, you're up to date with all your labs, you've done a lot of work on your website, I would continue on to these challenge problems, all right? For each one you complete, I will give you bonus points, all right? So you don't have to do them in order. You can pick and choose whichever ones that look interesting to you. But for every one that you're able to do, I will give you some bonus points, all right? So the first one is saying, write a program that uses a for loop that will add all of the numbers together from 1 to 100. So basically 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 plus 5 plus 6 plus 7. All right. This one says write a program that uses a single for loop to create the following sequence. And it warns you that you're going to need to create additional variables and use if statements. This one says create a for loop that counts up to 20, but it alternates between positive and negative numbers. So -1, 2, -3, 4, -5, 6, and so on and so forth. So there's a bunch of different problems here. I'm not going to read them all. But any of them that you're able to complete, I will give you bonus credit for completing them. And then down at the bottom here, there's just a couple of reminders talking about the percent sign, which is called the modulus operator, but it's basically giving you remainders. And just reminding you that when you're checking to see if something has a value, it's double equal sign. 1 equal sign is to set a value. All right. So let's take a look at this first one, because I'm going to get you started on it, and then you're going to have to take over from there. So it says, write a program that will count up from 30 to 50. So basically, it's going to print out to the screen 30, 31, 32, 33, all the way up to 50. So if you go to your for puzzle file and you right-click on it and choose Edit with Notepad++, you will see that it basically has a bunch of comments and not much else. All right. So the first comment says loop counter variable, right? That's just a reminder that with your loops, you need to have a variable. And if we're going to have a variable, we have to create the variable. So I'm just going to create a variable called I, and I can use that variable in all of my loops. I don't have to create a new variable each time. That one variable will work for all of my loops. Now in the second one here, problem 1, I'm going to start you off. So I'm going to start with the word for in all lowercase. I'm going to do a left parenthesis. And then what I'm going to do is I equals 0, I less than 0, I plus plus. Now, that's not going to work. You're going to have to modify that to get it to do what the problem actually asks for. But that's what I'm putting in right now, just to get you started. Then I'm going to do a left brace. I'm going to hit enter. I'm going to tab over. And then this is the code that's actually going to print the numbers out to the screen. So I'm going to say document dot write. I'm going to do a left parenthesis. I'm going to type I because I want to print out the variable I. And then so the numbers aren't all stuck together, I'm going to add a space to the end of that. So I'm going to do plus, left quotes. I'm going to put a space in there. I'm going to put in my right quotes. And then I'm going to close my parentheses and hit the semicolon. And then I'm going to hit enter, backspace, and make my left brace. All right, so this is the code that will actually print out the numbers for you. your goal is to fix this loop so that it does what the document asks. Because if I run this right now, view in Chrome, you're going to see that nothing pops up because the loop's not correct. Now, if I change this to 100, you're going to see that it produces from 0 to 99. So what you have to do is you have to go in here and change this so that it produces the right sequence. Once you've done that, then you have number 2, number 3, and number 4, which are all more or less the same thing. It's just modifying the loop. All right, you're changing those 3 terms inside of the for loop to get these different sequences that the problem asks. The challenge problems all require a little more. They require you to create variables. They require you to use if statements. But the 4 required problems are just kind of changing those parameters in the for loop to get these different sequences. All right, so I hope this was helpful. Obviously, if you run into any problems, let me know, and we'll go from there. All right, have a great day.